All right, so today we're tackling a pretty complex topic. It's a deep dive into the role of the UAE in conflicts that are actually happening outside of their borders.
Hmm, interesting.
Yeah, and this deep dive was specifically requested by one of our listeners.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so we all know that the UAE is this major player in the Middle East,
Right.
but things get a little bit murky when we start looking at how they're wielding that power in places like Yemen and Ethiopia, which are kind of caught up in these really volatile conflicts.
Yeah, and what's fascinating to me is that the UAE has managed to gain a ton of influence, but they've often done it very quietly, kind of operating under the radar.
So let's start there. Like, how did the UAE become such a force to be reckoned with, especially in terms of these like regional conflicts?
Well, for starters, they've got a lot of wealth, which gives them leverage, and then they've really mastered this art of like strategic alliances.
Okay, so they're not afraid to play the long game.
Not at all. They're really good at building relationships and using those connections to further their goals.
And it sounds like part of their strategy is to kind of exert their influence without always being like front and center.
Right. And that's where things get a little controversial because they rely heavily on these proxy forces, which makes it harder to hold them directly accountable.
Hmm. Okay, so before we get into the specifics of Yemen and Ethiopia,
Hmm.
can you just like quickly break down what you mean by proxy forces? Like, what does that look like in practice?
Sure. So basically, a proxy force is a group that's armed, trained, and often even funded by another country.
Ah, I see. So they're essentially acting on the UAE's behalf, but there's this layer of separation.
Exactly. And that gives the UAE a degree of deniability because they can kind of distance themselves from the actions of these groups.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's shift gears and talk about Yemen.
Sure.
I think most people are aware that there's a really brutal civil war going on there, but I feel like the UAE's role in it doesn't always get the attention it deserves.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a really complex situation. But to put it simply, the conflict started in 2015 when this group called the Houthi rebels,
Yeah.
they basically took control of the capital city, Sana'a.
And that triggered a response from Saudi Arabia, right?
Exactly. Saudi Arabia formed a coalition to fight back against the Houthis, and the UAE jumped in as a key member right from the beginning.
So we're talking about like direct military involvement.
Oh, yeah. The UAE has been actively involved in airstrikes and ground operations, but it's not just about direct combat.
You're talking about the proxy forces again?
Right. So in Yemen, the UAE has been supporting this group called the Southern Transitional Council, or STC.
And what's their deal?
They're a separatist movement. They basically want to break away from Yemen and form their own independent state in the south.
Wow, so that adds like a whole other layer of complexity to this conflict.
Totally. And it's part of the UAE's strategy. They often back these groups that are pushing for autonomy or independence.
But why?
Well, it helps them to exert their influence and advance their interests in the region.
Okay, so they're using these proxy forces to kind of stir the pot in a way that benefits them.
That's one way to look at it. And it's important to note that these proxy groups, they've been accused of committing some pretty serious human rights abuses.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to get into. The human rights situation in Yemen is already dire, but when you add the UAE and their proxies to the mix, things get even more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. There have been numerous reports of civilian casualties for UAE-led airstrikes,
Mm.
and there are also credible allegations of torture and extrajudicial killings happening in these secret prisons.
Wait, hold on, secret prisons?
Yeah, reportedly some of these are run directly by the UAE or their proxy forces.
And who are they detaining in these prisons?
It seems like anyone who's perceived as a threat or a critic of the UAE-backed factions, so we're talking about journalists, activists, even aid workers.
It's chilling, and it seems like they're deliberately trying to silence any opposition and control the narrative.
It definitely raises some serious questions about their intentions and the tactics they're willing to use to achieve their goals.
And then on top of all that, you have the blockade.
Right. The UAE has been a key player in enforcing a blockade on Yemeni ports, which has basically cut off the flow of essential goods and humanitarian aid.
It's hard to believe that a country can just cut off supplies to an entire population like that, effectively creating a man-made famine.
The humanitarian consequences have been absolutely devastating. Millions of people are on the brink of starvation. The healthcare system is in shambles, and an entire generation of children is growing up in the midst of this crisis.
It's just horrifying, and it seems like the UAE's actions, particularly their role in the blockade, have directly contributed to this suffering.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. They're a major player in this conflict, and their actions have had a profound impact on the lives of millions of Yemenis.
So we view this really intricate web of actors and interests in Yemen, with the UAE pulling a lot of strings, But they're not just involved in Yemen, right? Their role in the Tigray conflict in Ethiopia is also raising some serious red flags.
Exactly. And while the dynamics in Ethiopia are different, there are some striking similarities to the UAE's approach in Yemen.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. Like, what's the situation in Ethiopia and how does the UAE fit into all of this?
So the Tigray War, it started in late 2020, and it's basically a conflict between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF.
Things have escalated pretty quickly, haven't they?
Yeah, it's been incredibly brutal. There have been widespread reports of atrocities committed by both sides, but the Ethiopian government has been particularly condemned for their actions.
Yeah, the reports of massacres, systematic sexual violence, and the deliberate destruction of civilian infrastructure, it's just horrific.
Yeah, it's important to note that the UAE has been a staunch supporter of the Ethiopian government throughout this conflict.
So what kind of support are we talking about?
Well, there's evidence suggesting that the UAE has provided military aid to the Ethiopian government, including arms shipments.
And could this be linked to those atrocities that we were just talking about?
It's definitely possible those weapons could be contributing to the violence and suffering that's happening in Tigray.
And it's not just about conventional weapons, right? There have also been whispers about the UAE using mercenaries in Ethiopia.
Right now, it's hard to get concrete confirmation, but there are strong suspicions that the UAE might be deploying private military companies to support the Ethiopian government.
So in both Yemen and Ethiopia, we see this pattern of the UAE providing material support to actors who are accused of committing really serious human rights abuses.
It's a pattern that's hard to ignore,
Yeah.
and it raises some really uncomfortable questions about the UAE's foreign policy objectives and the methods they're willing to use to achieve them.
And it makes you wonder, are these just isolated incidents or is there something more systemic going on here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something that we'll need to delve into even further.
So we've established that the UAE is playing a pretty significant and controversial role in these conflicts, but what about the consequences? Like, what's the human cost of all of this?
Yeah, that's really what we need to focus on. Now, we can't lose sight of the fact that behind all these geopolitical maneuvers, there are real people whose lives are being shattered by these conflicts.
Absolutely. So let's dive into the humanitarian impact of all of this and try to really grasp the scale of the suffering that's happening in both Yemen and Ethiopia.
We've been talking about some pretty heavy stuff, about the UAE and their role in these conflicts.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It is, and it's easy to get caught up in the political and strategic aspects of it all.
Oh, absolutely. Like, it's fascinating to sort of unpack the geopolitics of it all. But we can't forget that there are real people who are bearing the bulk of this.
Exactly. At the end of the day, it's about human lives. It's about families and communities that are being torn apart.
So I think it's time that we shift our focus to the human cost of these conflicts. Like, what's the actual impact on the ground?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
I mean, we throw around terms like humanitarian crisis, but it's important to really understand what that means in practical terms.
Absolutely, and I think Yemen is a good place to start. I mean, the UN has called it the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and for a good reason.
Yeah, we talked about the blockade earlier, but can you just paint a picture for us? Like, what does that actually mean for the people living there?
Well, imagine a country where over 80% of the population needs humanitarian aid just to survive.
Wow.
We're talking about basic necessities like food, water, and medicine being in critically short supply.
And it's not like this is a natural disaster or anything. This is a man-made crisis.
Exactly. The blockade, which the UAE has been instrumental in enforcing, is a deliberate tactic of war.
And it's the civilians who are paying the price.
Absolutely. They're the ones who are suffering the most from this lack of access to essential goods.
I remember reading this article about a mother in Yemen who had to choose which of her children to feed because there simply wasn't enough food to go around.
God, that's heartbreaking.
It is, and it's stories like that that really bring home the reality of this situation.
And it's not just the physical suffering that we need to consider.
Right, the psychological impact of living through years of war and constant fear is immense.
Absolutely. We're talking about an entire generation of children who have known nothing but conflict and violence.
Like, what does that do to a society, to a people?
The trauma is profound, and it's going to have long-lasting consequences.
And then we have the situation in Ethiopia, which, while different, is also incredibly devastating.
Yeah, the Tigray conflict has resulted in mass displacement, widespread reports of atrocities, and a humanitarian crisis that's spiraling out of control.
It's hard to even comprehend the scale of the suffering that's happening there.
It's truly horrific, and I think it's important to acknowledge that while both sides have been accused of committing atrocities, the Ethiopian government has been particularly condemned for their actions.
And can you remind us again about the UAE's role in all of this?
Yeah, so as we discussed earlier, the UAE has been providing military support to the Ethiopian government.
And that support could be directly contributing to the violence against civilians.
That's right. There's a real possibility that the weapons and other aid that the UAE is providing are being used to commit human rights abuses.
So we have these two conflicts, both with significant UAE involvement and both resulting in unimaginable human suffering.
It's a grim reality.
And it's hard not to feel overwhelmed by it all. Like, what can we even do in the face of such immense suffering?
That's the question, isn't it? And there are no easy answers.
Yep.
But I think the first step is to acknowledge the problem, to really confront the human cost of these conflicts.
And what?
Well, we need to start asking some hard questions about accountability.
Like, who's responsible for these atrocities and what can be done to stop them?
Exactly. And that includes looking at the role of external actors like the UAE.
Because they're not just bystanders in all of this, they're actively contributing to the violence and suffering.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that there have been numerous reports from human rights organizations condemning the actions of the UAE in both Yemen and Ethiopia.
But has that led to any real consequences?
Unfortunately, not so far. It seems like the UAE has managed to avoid any serious repercussions for their involvement in these conflicts.
And why is that? Is it just because of their strategic importance?
Well, that's certainly a factor. The UAE has powerful allies, including the United States, and they play a key role in regional security and counterterrorism efforts.
So it feels like those geopolitical considerations are outweighing any concerns about human rights.
It's a difficult truth to swallow, but it seems to be the case.
So it's like we're stuck in this cycle where realpolitik trumps human rights, and those who are suffering the most are the ones who are paying the price.
And it's a cycle that we need to break.
But how?
Well, I think the first step is to raise awareness, to make sure that these issues don't fade into the background noise.
So we need to keep talking about these conflicts, keep shining a light on the human cost, and keep demanding accountability.
Exactly. We can't let the world forget about the people who are suffering in Yemen and Ethiopia.
Okay, so we need to keep the pressure on, but what about more concrete actions? Like, what can be done to actually stop the violence and bring about a lasting peace?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. There are no easy solutions, but I think there are some steps that the international community could take to at least start addressing the root causes of these conflicts.
Okay, so we've really gone deep on this one, huh? We've talked about the UAE's involvement in Yemen and Ethiopia. We've looked at the devastating humanitarian consequences, and we've even wrestled with this whole issue of accountability or the lack thereof.
Yeah, it's been a lot.
It has. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the big question on everyone's mind is, where do we go from here?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Like, what do we do with all of this knowledge? What does it mean for the future?
I mean, honestly, it's a bit unsettling to think that a country can operate with this level of influence, even when their actions are linked to such terrible things.
Right, and I think it speaks to a broader trend that we're seeing in global politics, where power dynamics are shifting and new players are emerging.
And those new players might not always play by the same rules.
Exactly. They might have different priorities, different values, and different ways of achieving their objectives.
So in the case of the UAE, it seems like they're really prioritizing their own strategic interests, even if that means turning a blind eye to human rights abuses.
And they're willing to use whatever tools are at their disposal to achieve those objectives, including proxy forces, economic leverage, and strategic alliances.
And that makes them a pretty formidable force.
Oh, absolutely. They're a major player on the world stage, and their actions have far-reaching consequences.
So what does this mean for the future? Like, should we be worried?
I don't know if worried is the right word, but it's definitely something to pay attention to.
Yeah, like we need to keep our eyes open and understand the implications of their actions.
Exactly, and I think it highlights the need for greater transparency and accountability in international relations.
Because if we allow countries to operate in the shadows with no consequences for their actions, that sets a dangerous precedent.
For sure, it erodes trust and undermines the international order.
So what can we do about it? Like, is there any way to hold the UAE accountable for their role in these conflicts?
Well, that's the tough part, isn't it? Because they have such powerful allies, and they're so strategically important.
It's like they have this shield of protection.
Yeah, in a way, and that's why it's going to take a concerted effort from multiple actors to really make a difference.
So what are you thinking?
Well, for starters, we need to keep the pressure on human rights. Organizations need to continue documenting and exposing abuses.
Right, shining a light on these dark corners.
Exactly, and governments need to be willing to use their diplomatic leverage to push for change.
Well, that can be tricky, right? Because there are always these competing interests and political considerations.
Oh, for sure. But I think it's important to remember that human rights should never be sacrificed for political expediency.
Okay, so we need to keep the pressure on. But what about more concrete actions? Like, are there any legal mechanisms that can be used to hold perpetrators accountable?
Well, there's the International Criminal Court, but it has its limitations.
Like what?
Well, it relies on the cooperation of states, and in cases like Yemen and Ethiopia, where the governments themselves are implicated, that cooperation is unlikely.
So it's a bit of a catch-22.
Yeah, can be, but that doesn't mean we should give up to it.
No.
There are other avenues that can be explored, like sanctions targeted at individuals or entities that are responsible for human rights abuses.
So it sounds like a multi-pronged approach is needed.
Definitely, we need a combination of pressure accountability mechanisms and a real commitment from the international community to uphold human rights.
Well, this has been a really thought-provoking deep dive, and I think it's clear that the UAE's role in these conflicts is incredibly complex and nuanced.
For sure, there are no easy answers, and it's
Sure.
going to require ongoing attention and effort to address these issues.
But one thing's for sure, we can't just stand by and watch while these atrocities continue.
Absolutely. We all have a responsibility to speak out, to demand justice, and to work towards a more peaceful and just world.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this journey and for engaging with these tough questions.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in and for caring about these issues. Remember, knowledge is power, and we can all make a difference by staying informed, staying engaged, and using our voices to advocate for positive change. So until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world.